Mr. President, we've spent a considerable amount of time discussing the debt and the deficit crisis this country is facing during the 112th Congress. Although we have heard from the President that we must raise the debt limit, neither he nor any of his Democratic colleagues, with the exception of the 3 senators and the Gang of 6, have presented us with a concrete plan to rein in spending and get our fiscal house in order. Meanwhile, every day we're spending more money that we don't have. While my Democratic colleagues continue to talk about the need to increase the debt limit and get our fiscal house in order, the House of Representatives has taken concrete action to make that happen. On Tuesday night, 234 members of the House of Representatives joined together to pass the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. The bill will put the country on a sound fiscal course at the same time that it gives the President $2 4/10 trillion in additional borrowing authority that he's asked us to provide. The problem we currently face is that we're spending too much money and borrowing too much money. I agree with our colleagues in the House that it only makes sense for us to increase the borrowing authority if we put the country on a path where that borrowing will eventually end, even though it's a long way out. The Cut, Cap, and Balance Act takes a 3-tiered approach to finding the right fiscal ship. First, it provides some substantial but reasonable cuts to spending immediately. The bill requires us to cut about 3% in spending from the bloated federal budget next year. That cut amounts to more than $100 billion in spending next year. The bill allows the House and Senate to determine where those cuts are most appropriate, and because we recognize the need to cut in appropriate areas, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act ensures that there are no immediate cuts to Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, or military salaries. At the same time we cut spending, the bill puts in place spending caps that prevent us from spending above a specific amount and puts our spending trajectory on a path where we can achieve a balanced budget. We all wish that we could balance the budget tomorrow, but we're spending money at such an alarming rate that it just isn't achievable. We're almost borrowing as much money as we take in revenue. The bill recognizes that fact and gradually caps spending so we can achieve balance. Finally, the bill gives the President the ability to borrow an additional $2 4/10 trillion he's requesting, subject to one condition: that Congress passes a balanced budget amendment. We all agree that we need to stop borrowing so much money. The only way to stop borrowing is to have a balanced budget, not spending more than we take in. We have a pretty good idea how much is coming in, how much is going out. That's why August 2nd is this day of crisis. And that's including the money that we borrow. And when we pay the interest, we have to borrow 40 cents on every dollar to pay the interest. If you have a maxed out credit card and you borrow to pay the minimum balance, do you think you'll ever pay that card off? Not a chance. That's the situation we're in. A balanced budget means that we won't spend money we don't have. Therefore, if the President wants to borrow $2 4/10 trillion more dollars from countries like China, we need to know that it won't force us to borrow money forever. Cut, Cap, and Balance does not ask for the time for states to ratify a balanced budget amendment after it passes. Their time to ratify gives us time to get where we need to go. Like families across America, we're going to have to decide what spending is essential. Families have as many ideas for spending money as the federal government does, but they know that it's not an option to spend what they don't have. They have to decide what's essential and what's nice to have. I think it's important to take a look at the problem we're facing. If you grasp the size of the problem, you'll share my sense of urgency that we must pass the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. Our national debt is around $14 3/10 trillion. Our national debt's almost equal to the whole economy of the United States, everything that's produced and sold in the United States. Our debt is almost equal to the whole economy of the United States. We call it GDP. That's so you don't really know what we're talking about. That means that if we were to pay off the debt every man, woman, and child in this country would need to write a check for more than $46,000. It'd be one thing if that number were projected to decrease, or if there were signs that we're making progress in bringing our budget back into balance. But that's not happening. Since the president took office in 2009, our national debt has increased by more than $4.4 billion each day, for a total increase of $3.7 trillion. I can already hear the president counter that he had a lot to clean up. At what point, when things are getting worse instead of better, is the president going to take ownership and provide a solution on paper? Lots of speeches, no paper. The stimulus didn't work, so let's not repeat it. If you keep doing what you've been doing, you shouldn't be surprised when you wind up with what you already got, the same result. Now, Margaret Thatcher, when she was prime minister, proved that putting the fiscal house in order increased the economy. They already tried some of the other things, but putting the fiscal house in order is what made the difference. In 2011, we're expected to spend $3.6 trillion. At the same time that we spend the $3.6 trillion, we'll have revenues of $2.2 trillion. That's a $1.4 trillion deficit. If we follow the president's budget, we'll have a deficit the next year of $1.2 trillion. The 10-year average, if we follow the president's budget proposal, is nearly $1 trillion in deficits each year. After his first term, the president's policies are expected to add almost as much debt held by the public as all the presidents in the history of the United States. That level of deficit cannot be sustained, and contrary to the opinions of my friends on the other side of the aisle, we cannot tax our way out of this problem. Failure to live within our means doesn't warrant taxing the taxpayers for Washington's failures. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the top 20% of income earners paid almost 86% of all federal taxes in 2007. Those individuals are the job creators in this country. Many of them are small businesses who reinvest their profits, even though they have to pay the taxes on them at that time. So they put the profits back into their businesses to make them grow. Increasing taxes at a time of economic struggle will cost jobs and will lead to more unemployment and higher deficits. Businesses are already reluctant to expand because of the increasing and detrimental regulations coming out every day of this administration. Some of the regulations aren't even from current law, so they'll be fought in the courts and they'll be overturned, but it'll be at a great expense, a great delay, as it will take over a 5-year period to do that, and we'll experience more pain than any cuts that we might make. Now, rather than increasing taxes, we need to cut spending and reform entitlement programs. Mandatory and entitlement programs now account for 62% of all federal spending, and that number continues to rise as the baby boomer generation retires. By comparison, mandatory and entitlement programs accounted for 33% of all federal budget spending in 1964. 33% up to 62%. The numbers don't lie. Entitlement programs are placing a stranglehold on our budget, and yet there are still calls from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to keep them as they are. Misinformation from campaigns of outside groups say there isn't a problem, and we can fix our budget simply by cutting earmarks and finding waste, fraud, and abuse. That's just not true. Even if the money from the Social Security Trust Fund that has been spent were returned, the length of time a person now lives makes the fund actuarially broke. These problems are too serious for us to ignore. Erskine Bowles, the co-chairman of the Deficit Commission, said it best when he testified that, quote, "We are facing the most predictable crisis in our nation's history," end quote. Everyone knows that we need to take action. Everyone knows that we need to make the tough choices necessary to right our fiscal ship. And yet there are some who suggest that we should not act, or that we should wait to act. To those members, I say that we've kicked the can down the road long enough. It's time for us to take serious action to change the trajectory of our spending habits and get this country in a condition that we can be proud to leave to our grandchildren. We've known that this debt limit debate was coming for months. We can all see that the government is spending money at a rate that will require us to authorize the Treasury Department to borrow more money. Although the date shifted, the fact that the government will breach the debt limit should come as no surprise to anyone. That's why it's so perplexing that the President and my Democratic colleagues have not presented any written plans to get the country back on track. Well, I guess the President did present one, and we voted on it, and it didn't get a single vote in this chamber. Not one vote. He didn't even talk one Democrat into voting for it. He had an outstanding opportunity to talk about the deficit crisis that the Deficit Commission pointed out. He could have done that in the State of the Union speech. He could have followed that up with a budget that would have mirrored what the Budget Commission said. That's kind of where this gang of six is right now with their suggestion. But that didn't happen. Instead, we move on to the crisis and figure that just raising the debt limit will solve everything. We've known it was coming for a long time, and in the House, Republicans passed a budget that would cut the spending by $5 8/10 trillion over the next 10 years. Senator Toomey and Senator Paul in this body presented their own budgets that would get our country back on track. Those were defeated. Senator Corker has introduced legislation that would cap spending levels and head us in the right direction. I've introduced legislation that would require us to reduce spending by 1% for 7 years and cap spending each year to balance the budget. It'll work in 7 years, 1%. Incidentally, that's probably how long it'll take the states to ratify the balanced budget amendment. If you're saying we can do it without a balanced budget amendment, you should also pass my 1% solution bill and prove that we can. A backup plan's always a good idea. Most businesses in the United States have to find a way to reduce spending by 1% to match the economy or to do the regulations we force on them. Most families have to find a way to spend 1 penny less out of every dollar or face a financial crisis. Why can't the United States do 1%? 1% each year. By making the 1% spending cut, we'd save around $7.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Balance our budget, and we put the country on a sustainable spending path. Republicans have offered all of these plans, and we continue to hear only silence from the other side. The only plan presented by the majority, as I mentioned, was President Obama's fiscal year 2012 budget, which was unanimously opposed. When the president and the majority don't lead, some bill has to take the lead. Members of the House proved that on Tuesday night by passing a plan that allows the president to have his debt limit increase and get our country back on track. The Cut, Cap, and Balance Act is a responsible solution to the problems we face. We are spending too much. Too much spending leads to too much borrowing. To rein in spending, we must make immediate cuts that prove Congress can act, and we must cap future spending to ensure that our spending levels do not grow at an unsurmountable level. To prevent future borrowing, we need to put in place a mechanism that will require us to balance the budget. 49 states require a balanced budget, and it's well past time for the federal government to show the same fiscal restraint. The president's asked us to give him the ability to borrow $2 4/10 trillion more dollars. That's $2 4/10 trillion that our children and grandchildren will have to pay back, and if the crisis worsens, it'll move up to the current generation. It's money that we'll need to borrow from countries like China, who are our competitors in the world and who do not necessarily share the same values. I don't take that responsibility lightly. This responsibility requires immediate action to correct the problem and prevent future generations from having to make the tough choices our out-of-control spending has forced us to make. The House took the responsibility seriously and passed the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act to right our fiscal ship. At the same time, we give the president the borrowing authority he so desires. The United States Senate should follow suit and pass the Cut, Cap and Balance Act immediately.